The Queen's state funeral had been planned for decades, with millions spent and thousands involved. Will the pomp of it all save the monarchy? On a momentous, if not surprising day, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing?
Very happy to be joining you, Michael. What an important, mighty, auspicious day in modern British history. Look forward to examining it in closer detail with the best person I can think of.
Well, apparently, since we're talking superlatives, this is going to be the most important event, or it will have been the most important event ever, and that will ever happen. You'll find out later in the show who said that if you haven't already seen on Twitter. We do want to know your comments and questions. Did you watch the state funeral? Did any of it stand out to you? Was there anything that was surprising about it? Did you watch it fuming at all the money spent, or were you quietly impressed at? I mean, it was quite smooth. It was pretty well organised, I have to say. The Daily Mail estimated 4.1 billion people would watch the Queen's funeral. That seems a little overstated to me, but the first state funeral since the death of Winston Churchill was undoubtedly a grand affair. At around 10:44 a.m., the Queen's coffin was towed from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey by Royal Navy sailors. There it was carried inside by soldiers from the Queen's company, with the royal family and members of the palace household following behind. At the service, there were lots of Bible readings, including this from Liz Truss.
In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also.
The Archbishop of Canterbury was a slightly more engaging speaker.
People of loving service are rare in any walk of life. Leaders of loving service are still rarer. But in all cases, those who serve will be loved and remembered when those who cling to power and privileges are long forgotten. Her late Majesty's broadcast during COVID lockdown ended with, "We will meet again." Words of hope from a song of Vera Lynn.
That comment from Welby about clinging to power was read either as a dig at Boris Johnson or the various autocrats in the room, I think, depending on who was listening. More impressive than the service, though, was the pomp that followed. Viewers watched as the coffin was again towed by members of the Royal Navy, this time past large crowds as it made its way to Wellington Arch by Hyde Park. The coffin was then transferred to a hearse and driven to Windsor. Onlookers lined the road for large parts of that journey. And there were more large crowds and a procession as the hearse arrived at Windsor Castle. There was then another televised service, and the Queen is due to be interred in a private ceremony at 7:30 p.m. Aaron, what did you make of it all? You know, it's been built up, the first state funeral since Winston Churchill. Obviously, a lot of time, money, effort went into it. Is it politically significant, what we've seen today?
That's a bit of a strange question, Michael. Is it politically significant? I think it's too soon to tell. And often, people are trying to have their take and be first in and say, this is the definitive account of what this means and what's finished and what started. The truth is we don't know. I think the things we'll be talking about over the rest of this show, some of the responses to it, I think do suggest what may be in our path over the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years. Clearly, given the crowds, there is massive, I think, inarguably, support for the monarchy in England. There is no overt hostility. And yes, of course, it's a funeral. People don't make problems at funerals, but it's important to say, even with the investiture of Prince Charles, for instance, in the 1960s, there were bomb scares and so on. There was nothing like that today. So very calm, very peaceful, very tranquil. All of the platitudes, and they are platitudes, about the stability of Britain, the peaceful transfer of power and or across generations with regards to the monarchy, all of those were in evidence today. So in terms of political sort of meaning, no idea. And I think it would be a fool's errand to say what it means. I think the sort of hard yards of monarchy and the reign of King Charles III will be over weeks, months, years, and whether he's popular or unpopular will be defined by that, not by how the cameras interpreted the spectacular events of today, as visually stunning as they were. So, in terms of making political conclusions, I would suggest that's unwise.
I suppose on the more mundane level, maybe this is putting on show my lack of knowledge about how royal state events usually go. But watching the hour-long service, which was, when you had the readings, the songs, and the sermon from the Archbishop of Canterbury, I was kind of expecting to hear more stuff about the Queen. Like, for me, a good funeral may be a strange phrase, but a funeral which you sort of remember, that brings you to peace with the person who passed, should have at least a couple of jokes, should have some anecdotes about the person. I probably should have known this wouldn't happen. Maybe it's not part of tradition, but I was expecting, maybe Charles to speak, someone who actually knew her very well. But apart from Justin Welby's sermon, it was all just psalms and hymns and stuff. I don't know, Aaron, is that surprising to you? That's not what I would expect a funeral to normally look like.
I think you've hit on something really important, Michael, which is that this was a funeral for a head of state, for an institution, for a part of the political apparatus of this country for 70 years, less than for a person, a human being who lived a life, who had children, grandchildren, so on. Maybe that's part of the private service that the family has later on. But like you say, it's important to remember somebody died, and this entire ceremony is actually about, well, the span of life that you lived and how it relates to the British state and the function you performed as, head of the royal family, the head of the aristocracy in this country. I do find it a bit strange. I mean, there's obviously not going to be many other funerals like it. That said, Michael, I'm not all that familiar with Anglican funerals, I have to be honest. The funerals I've been to have been either Catholic or relatively secular. But it is a shame nobody talked about her as she was as a human, which actually, in terms of the sort of popular appeal of the royals, that is the stuff that cuts through. Oh, they're just like us. And of course, they're not just like us. But there are, like you say, personal stories that all the people, well, nearly all the people in that room would have, and which I'm sure they'd love to relate, particularly her closest family members. So, yes, but again, that sort of underscores the point here, right? This is a moment of political state-managed theatre rather than the funeral of somebody. So it is quite unique in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I have been to a couple of Anglican funerals, probably never like a kind of high Anglican funeral like this. But normally you have like one religious figure, in my experience, you have one religious figure, be that the vicar or the priest or whatever. I suppose it wouldn't be a priest if it's Anglican. And they do a couple of hymns, they sort of introduce, do an outro, but then in between you have members of the family come up, someone reads a poem, someone gives an anecdote and a joke. It's all a bit more... It was a bit varied. I thought the sermon or the service was a little bit repetitive for me, but nonetheless, obviously impressive. I mean, visually, it was very, very impressive, the whole thing, and there were quite big crowds for most of it. So I'm sure that monarchists and the people who were organising this will come away from this thinking, job well done. We have 2,000 of you watching so far on YouTube. Do like the video if you haven't already. The VIPs in attendance at the Queen's state funeral included 19 serving monarchs, 55 presidents, and 23 prime ministers. But there was one category of invitees whose presence seemed more anachronistic. They included Prince Pavlos of Greece.
Crown Prince Pavlos is here. He's travelled to London for Queen Elizabeth's funeral. He's the eldest son and second child of Constantine II, the last king of Greece from 1964 to 1973. Queen Elizabeth is his third cousin, twice removed. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. What are your memories of the Queen?
Well, the Queen has always been a very kind person to my family, always received us with a smile. My parents were very well taken care of by her when we left Greece, and obviously lived in England for many years thereafter. And my father was always a good confidant for the family and was always by her side. And sadly, he's not so well now, so he's unable to come over. So I'm going with my mother and my wife to stand in for my father. But the Queen was always receiving us with great smiles and family friendship. Always inquiring of how things were going on back home or elsewhere. One of the most wonderful people ever.
One of the most wonderful people ever. So much has been said about her empathy and kindness. That's something you saw up close.
Her empathy, her kindness, and her service. And she was a real guiding force for the rest of us young people, not only from her family, from beyond that, and for her husband as well, Duke of Edinburgh. Both of them were dedicated to their service. And that came through in a very natural way to us as well, because they'd ask you questions on what you were doing in life and how you were getting on, and expected to move on in the right way. And those were great guidelines that she kept till the very end.
That interview was notable not just because the only question posed by the supposedly neutral BBC journalist was, so just how kind was the Queen? Can you give us all the examples of her being kind? But because the supposed Crown Prince of Greece is no such thing. Greece abolished their monarchy in a referendum in 1974. They have no kings, queens, princes, or princesses. But Prince Pavlos is not the only royal pretender who attended the Queen's funeral. This is a screenshot from the Wikipedia page listing attendees at that state funeral. And this is the section of members of non-reigning royal houses. It includes the Archduke of Austria, which is a republic, the Tsar of Bulgaria, which is a republic, the Prince of Venice, which is part of the Italian Republic, and the Crown Prince of Yugoslavia, a country which no longer exists. Aaron, what's the deal here? What's going on? How can the BBC introduce someone as the Prince of Greece when people in Greece are watching and say, we have a prince? We're a republic. We don't have a prince. What's going on? What's the background? How do we understand this?
Yeah, I have to say my favourite was the Prince of Venice. A nice little fact for our viewers out there, the House of Savoy, which was the Italian royal family, of course, they became a republic also by referendum in 1945, 46. Huge majority a big majority to become a republic. It was, I think, until 2002 that they weren't physically allowed back in the country, which I just find really funny. Basically they were exiled for 60 years because they weren't trusted to not try and seek a return to power. And I think that underscores all of this, Michael. These people don't give up these titles because they think one day I will be allowed back in. I can be the Tsar of Bulgaria, or maybe there'll be the reformation of the Austro-Habsburg Empire, or maybe Greece will have a need for a constitutional monarch above the political fray. And of course, that might sound ridiculous. You'd say, well, why would they want that? Well, apparently it's good enough for Britain, so why can't it be good enough for Greece? If there was a political crisis, I'm sure those people would make those arguments. And if you think I'm being ridiculous, look at Afghanistan in the aftermath of the occupation in 2001-2. There were conversations then about, well, why don't we install a monarch? Where there was a monarchy there until I think the 60s. Why don't we reinstall a monarch and they can be above the everyday political fray? Or in Iran, there was, of course, a revolution there in 1979. They got rid of the Shah. His son today is still in the United States and Beverly Hills, raising money and lobbying the White House. And he still thinks that one day he'll be back in, the Gulistan Palace in Tehran, ruling over his kingdom as he sees it. I think that's the case for lots of these people. They view this as their birthright and that one day they may have a shot at getting it back. It's happened before. I have to say, I think that the Yugoslavia probably is a bit of a push, Michael, given, like you say, it no longer exists as a political entity. Important to say also, it didn't exist until the Treaty of Versailles. It's not like it's some ancient, archaic country. It was put together after 1919. So it was a pretty short-lived political experiment, only, 70 years. And of course, for the majority of that time, it was a republic under a communist regime. So, I think that's rather hopeful. But I think others, they think maybe one day, why not? Italy, Greece. And I think this is an important takeaway for our audience, Michael. History doesn't just move in one direction. There are reactionary forces in this world who would like those people back in seats of unelected power and authority. And that's what the left has historically posed itself against. And the fact that these people see this as an opportunity to put themselves the forefront of popular sort of culture and consciousness is deeply troubling, but expect more of it. Because my take is, and I think sort of some of the arguments I've seen in response to Queen Elizabeth dying is less kind of Whiggish defenses of monarchy, but actually overtly reactionary ones. So yes, we'll see a lot more of these people, I think.
Yeah, and I think their presence, and there were a few moments watching events today where it did seem like what I'm watching is not just a bit silly and a bit embarrassing. And there are lots of parts, as we'll talk about later in the show, lots of parts of this period of national mourning where I have thought some of it's quite sweet. we'll talk about the queue in a moment. But there are other parts of it. You think this is like all the forces of reaction assembled in a room, and then the entire British media saying this is completely normal, and not only normal, it's wonderful. And and you do think if you've assembled in that room in the funeral, the descendants of all of these people who were overthrown in democratic revolutions or democratic referendums because they were anti-democratic, then to have them there and us all just sort of be celebrating it as normal. And I mean, to be honest, if you're watching the BBC there and you don't know the context, you think Greece has a prince, which also kind of serves to normalize the monarchy, because it's like, oh no, everyone's got a monarch. Austria's got an archduke. Greece has got a prince. Even Venice has got a prince. It's like, no, these people are pretending. They're not real royals. They abolished it. And maybe we should do that too. The police have given Republican protesters a hard time since the death of the Queen, but they're even tougher if you're a stray skater on a road meant for the King.
This is abuse, mate. What's the point? What's the point? Ow. Coffee! He's raining me, mate. Someone, please. You don't need to do. I'll come. This isn't necessary, then. Okay, this is not strangling me. Hey. Okay, I'm good. I didn't know, mate. I was going fast. The road was open, bro. I didn't. Get him up. I'm getting up. I know. I need cuff.
Now, I have no doubt the police are under a lot of pressure when it comes to guarding the royals and all of these VIPs visiting. They'll be on the lookout for terrorist threats and the like. But that seemed, to say the least, very disproportionate to me. Not everyone would agree, though. Here's that moment from a different angle.
I know, there's always one, isn't there? Look at that. Yeah, idiots. What are you there?
Shoot him. Wow. Aaron, has the Queen's death brought out Britain's more authoritarian side?
No. These people always exist, Michael. I know. We have obviously an audience across age ranges, and I'm sure our older members of our audience will be fully aware of just how reactionary some people are. If you're a bit younger and you go to university in London and you just live in London and you had progressive parents, this is a lot of people. I mean, I sort of know that because my mother she was a Tory voter. I think I've talked about this before. She was sort of working class Thatcherite, came out of the 80s, had a small business. She had a sandwich shop. She identified with Thatcher. She loved Princess Di. Strange woman, because she also really hated the royals because of how they treated Princess Diana. It was a very strange contradiction there. She would say things like, send in the army, or, that old platitude. Maybe you remember this from being a kid, Michael. What we need is a good war. People would say that. Of course, the only people that would say that were the sort of only generation of that century who hadn't actually seen a good war, which was, the boomers. So, no, this stuff is very much in the national political idiom. It's not going on anytime soon. We can talk about where it comes from, of course. That's pretty quite a long conversation. Important to say that only SO15 actually have firearms of all British police. Very strange thing to say, shoot him. But that is, again, it is a reflex that is there in the British psyche, English psyche increasingly. Shoot him, send in the army. They haven't got guns. They did what they did because they don't have guns. SO15 have guns. You're a firearms unit which have guns. British police, as one would hope, will stay for the rest of our lives, do not have firearms on them. So, idiots, lots of them, Michael. That's why I kind of this is very irrelevant, really. Going back to the whole Brexit thing, when people were saying, 400 constituencies voted to leave the EU, but we can change their minds. No. If you can sort of address these people and sneak in some socialist policies and public ownership, you're doing really well. But you're not going to stop this.
I'm sure there was someone close enough to I keep calling him Prince Charles, King Charles's car with a gun. A copper with a gun. Fox was saying, just as that clip was ending, that skater did actually get pretty close to Charles's car. I don't know how he managed to get that far or why the road was completely open. Slightly bizarre. Before we move on, Aaron, policing. one element of this past week, what will it be remembered for? Trying to arrest people with signs that say abolish the monarchy, or the fact that, to be fair to them, this is all passed without any big bad events. I mean, it's not a particularly journalistic word, but there hasn't been any tragedies. No one seems to have got crushed. There hasn't been anything that seems to have gone particularly wrong. Are they going to be patting themselves on the back?
This week will be remembered for two things, Michael. Today and the queue. Nothing else will be remembered because those are the things that serve, formal establishment political interests. The spectacle of the queue, Michael. That's all we're going to hear about 40, 50 years time. Were you there in the queue? No, I wasn't. I found it a bit odd that people were willing to stand for 15 hours to walk past somebody's coffin, but each to their own. If it was an hour, maybe I would have gone. I know that caused some upset in the interview I did with Ash that we published on Novara Media yesterday, but I think that's how people will reflect on this, is the remarkable queue of 2022.
I did queue for an hour to go to Buckingham Palace, just sort of out of interest. Also, I was a bit of a crowd truther. I was like, the crowds are not that big. There's barely anyone standing behind this BBC reporter. In a way, I think that was because of the way they'd managed the situation. I can't really deny that lots of people have wanted to be involved. We do want your support. Novara Media survives from the support of its regular donors. If you aren't already one, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate whatever you want every month. If you already are, thank you so much. You make all of this possible. The Queen's funeral was an impressive affair, but even with all the pomp, I'm not sure it met the expectations set by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle. He said this to BBC's Laura Koonsberg.
It's been important to try and make sure we get it right, and it's about showing the respect and the dignity and doing it in the right way. And we should not allow anything to overshadow the most important event the world will ever see, and that's the funeral of Her Majesty. And the passing of Her Majesty has brought people together.
The most important event the world will ever see. Why has the Queen dying turned our entire media and political class into toddlers? Like that is something that you would hear in like a Disney film. The most important event the world will ever see. More important than, Allies winning the Second World War or the Communist Revolution in China. More important than going to the moon. A 96-year-old woman who, ostensibly didn't have any political power dying.
Well, he didn't, Michael, important caveat here. He didn't say human history. He said the world has ever seen. So presumably we can include, the Big Bang, the arrival of life, I'm being serious, the first mammals, humans about 200,000 years ago, agriculture about 12,000 years ago. Lindsay Hoyle, no, that all comes second to today. Well, we're very lucky if that's the case. We've seen it on BBC One this afternoon, if that's true. Very fortunate. Look, this goes to the fundamental point of monarchy as a political system is, of course, it rests upon sycophancy. It's generated by sycophancy. Its intellectual basis is sycophancy and a belief in human subordination. And some people literally being born to rule and others not. Now, of course, we've had in the last 150 years, people sort of mitigate that a little bit, say, well, we don't really believe in it, but, it's just, it's the least worst system. I mean, I prefer Republican theory. Okay, some republics don't work out, but the idea that your son or daughter is born and they're, just as good to reach the very, top of executive power in the country as anyone else, I think that's a really powerful idea. Look, Joe Biden was in there today, Michael, probably the least posh person in there, yet he is at the top of the political system of the most powerful nation in history. I think that's a really remarkable, animating story for a country, for a nation, for a people, personally. But in answer to your question, why are all these people being so sycophantic? Well, monarchy is a system which is based upon sycophancy. And the way he said Majesty, he couldn't say it. He couldn't say it quietly enough. Majesty, And Lindsay, this gentleman, the Speaker of the House, because he's got a non-received pronunciation accent, people think, red wool, proper Labour man. His dad was an MP. He comes from a sort of political family. Maybe he got there on his own merits. I don't know, Michael. But you can go really far in life and in this country if you just make your nose as brown as possible, especially in politics, particularly in politics. You can have a great political career if you just brown nose the establishment and the status quo, say that nothing is wrong, everything is hokey dokey, and the sunshine comes out their backside. You'll do really well. And Lindsay Hoyle, he's a prime example of it.
An interview I'd really like to do, actually. I suppose just to plug a Novara video that went out today that I think is very good. My colleague Rivka Brown was talking to people who were in the queue, sort of about their experiences, and sometimes sort of slightly sort of challenging their views about the monarchy or whatever. Very interesting. What I would really like to do, though, is an interview with someone like Lindsay Hoyle or one of the BBC journalists who've been talking to us for the past 8 days and finding out, do you really believe this? Because I obviously, when Lindsay Hoyle is on the Laura Kuenssberg show, no one is going to say to him, do you really mean that? Because that's not how BBC coverage works at this period of time. You know, someone will give an anecdote and they say, oh God, that's such a lovely story you've told. Have you got anything else nice to say about the Queen? That's literally all interviews are. But I would love to sit down with Lindsay Hoyle or Hugh Edwards or whoever, one of the people who've been on TV and not, you know, said objectively, look, this is obviously a significant moment, so we're going to report on it, saying that the Queen is a wonderful, fabulous woman. This is the most important event ever in Lindsay Hoyle's case. And just have that conversation. You know, not grill them, but have that conversation, because I would love to see how Lindsay Hoyle would be able to sort of explain and justify that. It's slightly different with Keir Starmer. Obviously, he's been saying lots of ridiculous things, but the argument with him is he wants to get elected, so he's got to brown nose the Queen as much as possible. Lindsay Hoyle isn't, you know, I don't think he has to stand for election because he's the Speaker of the House of Commons, right? So who's he doing this for? And it's exactly the same with all of these journalists. Who are you doing this for? Have you sort of forced yourself to believe, or is this just what you're saying to fit in? Or you know, is it sort of four-dimensional chess, and the sort of the very thoughtful, intelligent side of you has decided that actually constitutional monarchy is the best way to maintain stability in this country, and for it to continue, people like us have to pretend that, you know, essentially the divine right of kings still exists. Very briefly on that, Aaron, where do you think it falls?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to basic patronage, Michael. If you want to get ahead, if you want to be rewarded, you want to get that knighthood, you want to be in the House of Lords, then you need to say the right things. We saw it with David Beckham last week. You know, again, I'm not going to impugn David Beckham. I don't know his motives for being in that queue. But what we've seen historically is in emails that have been disclosed, which were meant to be private communications, him saying, well, look, I came out for keeping the UK together during the Scottish referendum campaign. I've done X, I've done Y. You know, why haven't I been rewarded with a knighthood? And that is a very toxic system of patronage. The idea that, well, I'll do everything the establishment says if I'm allowed to, you know, have a few letters after my name, or if I can go and sit in the House of Lords and sit my ass and get £300 a day and do nothing. That's a really bad problem. And so I think whether or not you're a monarchist or a Republican, the systems of patronage that this engenders as a country are really counterproductive. It doesn't help solve problems. It gives rise to a really decadent, useless political class. It gives rise to a media which fundamentally isn't even interested in listening to people, let alone trying to give them a voice. So I would say alongside that, Michael, because of course you're talking about his comments on the BBC, this really illustrated the extent to which the BBC is not a public service broadcaster. It is a state broadcaster. There is no alternative reality or set of events where the BBC does this story in any other way. If it had a different chairman, if it had a different board, they would not make different editorial choices. The reason being, because the BBC is a state broadcaster. Lindsay Hoyle says that on the Laura Kuenssberg show, because of the intimate relationship in this country between the media and the state and political power, particularly the BBC. Everybody knows that, everybody believes that, except for several thousand liberals, and pretty much all of them work in the media and politics.
The Queen's funeral came with lots of pomp and VIPs, but it's the queue to see the Queen lying in state that will be remembered as the real success story of this period of national mourning. With hundreds of thousands of people queuing for up to 24 hours to see the Queen's coffin, it's hard to deny there was a significant well of affection for her. But the queue also became an attraction in and of itself.
Everybody's here for their parents and their grandparents of that generation that have done so much. And I mean, look at all these people. This is our little group. We've got a WhatsApp group, the Queen's Queue.
And how have you kept yourself busy during the night?
Talking to people.
Yeah.
Making friends.
Yeah.
Thinking about the Queen.
So you met in the queue. Tell me about it.
Yeah, we all turned up here first thing to want to pay our respects to Her Majesty and joined the queue back at Southwark Bridge and just struck up a conversation, and we've been chatting for the last 6 hours, and
chatting, and we formed a little WhatsApp group and sent each other pictures of things that have shared pictures, things that have been happening, and it's been very lovely. It's been extra special to have met people.
Yes, there has been lots of talk of people making friends in their 13-hour or 6-hour or 20-hour waits to see the Queen. Lots of WhatsApp groups formed, of course. And there's been non-stop coverage of the queue, which hasn't always brought out the best in British journalism. This was a push notification pushed out from the BBC. Watch. David Beckham turns to crisps and donuts to keep him going in his wait to see the Queen lying in state. So cutting edge public service journalism there. David Beckham, of course, earned lots of praise for queuing. Meanwhile, though, ITV's Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby became public enemies when they appeared to skip it. This Twitter user shared a screenshot of the pair and said, "Can we all agree that we're done with Holly Willoughby and Philip Schofield?" It gets over 5,000 retweets. Another said, "This is a photo taken by my sister's husband yesterday after he had queued with my sister, their 10-year-old daughter and my disabled mum for 13 hours. My mum was ushered out of Holly Willoughby's and Philip Schofield's way so they could hashtag queue jumpers without even a thanks. Hashtag Schofieldgate, hashtag queue jumpers." Now, we can't verify the contents of that tweet, but in any case, the backlash was so big that ITV had to release a statement clarifying that Holly and Philip were only there for work purposes. Now, if Holly and Philip might have preferred not to be photographed, others went to great lengths to ensure there was evidence of their visits. This Tory councillor must have scrolled back iPlayer to find this footage of himself bowing for the Queen. Very, very genuine, I think, to go and pay your respects and then scroll back on the news so that you can tweet it out afterwards. But if that strikes you as pure cynicism, it's hard not to find the next video at least a little bit cute.
We met at like 10:30 last night. We've been with each other throughout the whole thing till now, yeah. We've actually got loads of things in common.
Yeah. So will you stay in touch?
Yeah,
100%.
We're going to the funeral on Monday together.
Are you?
Yeah.
And how are you feeling about that? The funeral's going to be...
I mean, it's going to be sort of mixed emotions, and it's sort of, I guess, something that is like part of history, so we want to be there and sort of share that moment, I guess, with someone else.
And how are you feeling about it? It's a huge day.
Well, it's pretty kind of going to be like somber, really, and the whole thing, like seeing the Queen go down, like through to, is it Windsor? It's just be weird to see, really.
And how have you found being in this queue, no sleep?
Well, I don't know about you, but for me, I was like, meeting you guys was like a blessing in disguise, because it was like, I thought I was going to be exhausted, but like it's just gone so quickly in the queue.
How have you kept each other going? Have there been tricks of the trade?
No, just I guess like just like sharing stories, having laughs and like banter.
Good chat.
Yeah, good chat.
Great
yeah.
chat.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Any snacks? You had any snacks?
What do we have?
Kettle crisps.
Yeah.
Croissants.
Yeah.
So the crisps in the chat have been crucial.
Yeah, made it.
It's got very first date vibes. He says kettle chips. Like, kettle chips. It's cute. I'm happy for them in any case, even if it's probably not my dating pool that the queue represents. Finally, this was a brief interview between Sophie Rayworth and two of the last people in the queue.
With me now, Sarah and Mark, who were, if not the last people, very much the last people
we were
in the queue last night. What was that like?
Amazing. I think it's the best thing I've ever done in my life. Even having my children, Lily and Luca, I think this tops that.
Our commiserations go out to Lily and Luca. Aaron, what's your take on the queue as a social and political phenomenon?
Well, I think in many ways it encapsulates some of the stranger things about Britain. And I think the first one being that it was clearly miserable, and people are presenting it as something euphoric and wonderful. I mean, I'm sure they want to go and see the Queen rest in state. I mean, they can make a lot of time doing that. But I presume they would have preferred to have gone there within an hour or 2 hours, not have to wait 14, 15 hours, 24 hours. I think there was something like apparently 400 people had health complications while waiting, Michael. I mean, it's quite a lot of people. And of course, it was quite cold. So look, I find it quite strange. There is also a part of me that thinks, this was managed in such a way to, of course, generate a more interesting sort of political spectacle for the audience and for history and for those watching from overseas. You could have had QR codes and people could come at certain times. Of course, you could have. That wouldn't have generated the spectacle, this visual sublime that, of course, the BBC and the Palace would have wanted. Understandably so, but it would have saved a lot of waiting for people. Look, Michael, I've said this repeatedly over the last 10 days. I don't understand this country anymore. When my dad came to this country in the late 1970s, it was a country of understatement, restraint, stiff upper lip. And now people sort of cry because their children tell them that they're going to be protected by the new king. And they say that waiting in a queue for 14 hours gave them more happiness than giving birth to two children. I don't understand these people, Michael. So maybe I'm not the best person to ask. Maybe you're going to get more wisdom and insight from the comments.
I mean, I think I disagree with you on people would have preferred it to have been a 1 hour wait, because I do think that people ended up going kind of for the queue. I mean, obviously, that these aren't going to be people who are like Republicans or who hate the Queen, but I don't think necessarily people thought, I really want to see the Queen and it's unfortunate there's a 13-hour queue. I think probably a lot of people went to see the Queen because they saw the queue. And I actually think, obviously I don't really back the reason they're queuing, but I respect that desire to be part of something communal and to stand next to strangers for 13 hours. Like, it is often in those sort of difficult, awkward moments that are very memorable, and you do make like quite long-lasting relationships. I suppose you probably have similar memories that I do, Aaron, sort of like activism in our early 20s when you squat a building and you have to do something that's quite uncomfortable for a few hours. You're eating, someone brings in some food after 6 hours where you haven't had any and everyone's sort of sharing it. It's all quite charming and memorable. And I feel like this just gave people an excuse to do that. And I suppose why I think that's potentially politically relevant is because I feel like Republicans probably do need to have an answer as to where that's going to come from. Obviously, once every 70 years, getting to queue for 13 hours is not a huge advert for monarchism. But I do think there is a desire for people to be part of something collective. And I think if that is physically uncomfortable, that doesn't necessarily detract from it, because it's the difficulty of doing it which sort of brings which brings people together. If it's comfortable, people won't start talking to each other. They get to laugh about how many kettle chips they had for 12 hours. It's kind of interaction people, I think, yearn for. What do you think of that?
I think there's something to that, Michael. I mean, like you say, the idea of deferred gratification and perhaps the emotional investment given in actually finally walking past the coffin. I'm sure a lot of that was added to by the fact you've had to wait for 14, 15 hours in a queue. I mean, you're comparing it to squatting a building. I don't think I could stay on my feet for 15 hours and just shuffle along. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's really easy if you want to see something at the end of it. I do think you've hit on a really important point there, Michael, which is a lot of this is not, like you say, committed royalists and monarchists. I'm sure, like the overwhelming majority of people going to this, of course, they support the royal family. But I don't think that, they're deeply emotionally invested in ideas of monarchism. I think they could vote for all parties and none. I think you'd have a range of sort of esoteric, wild opinions on virtually everything. I don't think this is a homogenous block of people. I agree with you. But what does bring them together, and I think this is generally underestimated by the left and Republicans, is the desire to be part of something bigger than themselves. And of course, the nation allows you to do that. Investment in the nation allows you to do that. What I don't understand, though, with the royal family, Michael, is, and it's put very well by Tom Nairn, is that most nations have a series of dynasties, right? So if you look at Iran, Persia, a series of dynasties. You've got most recently the Pahlavis, the Qajars, you've got the Achaemenids thousands of years ago, very famous from all the Greek expeditions and whatnot, the Parthians, the Sassanids. And of course, we've had many dynasties in this country, the Tudors, the Stuarts and whatnot. But with the House of Windsor and the modern royal family, it doesn't feel like it's a nation with a dynasty, but rather a dynasty with a nation, like the national bit's tied onto it. And I think that's what revolts me about it more than anything else. That's what, I have criticism of monarchy anyway. But when, for instance, we have the armed forces not pledging allegiance to a people or a nation state, but a monarch and their successors, I don't see why people would be invested in that. Because it's almost like it comes from a place of believing in your own subordination and your unimportance. And so I suppose if you take what you're saying, which I agree with, and then that conclusion, you think, well, it should be quite easy for Republicans to be able to sell a vision of society and politics which is more alluring and attractive than this. I think it's certainly easier than they recognize, but that says a hell of a lot about the Republican movement, doesn't it? That actually people can get more enthused about waiting in a queue for 14 hours eating kettle chips than anything that the other side has to offer. And I think that's cause for reflection.
I suppose also that there is a bit of a path dependency here, though, because it's if the whole point is you're doing something that someone else is doing, then the Republicans are already starting from a difficult position, because being a counterculture as opposed to like this big dominant culture is more difficult potentially. Obviously, some people prefer it. We have a poll in a moment, which is going to show there is one thing on which Novara Media is aligned with the public when it comes to the Queen and her death. Before that, though, do please like this video. The public think the media have gone overboard in their coverage of the Queen's death. YouGov asked people whether media coverage of the event had been too much, too little, or about right, and these were the results. So 41% say it was about right, 49% say it was too much, only 2% said it was too little. So there are 2% of people who think we needed more than 24-hour rolling coverage. So the BBC would probably have had to have invented another hour in the day. And don't knows was 8%. Aaron, finally, the public agree with us on something.
Yeah. Although I do love that 2% who don't think there's been enough media coverage. What would they like to have seen? I would love us to seek those people out, and just say, well, what would you have liked? What should we have done? Because it was wall to wall on pretty much every channel all of the time. The exception today, of course, being Channel 5, who had a film about emojis.
They had the emoji movie, yeah.
The emoji movie, I don't know. I'm too old to understand a film about emojis. Just so,
I don't know what it is even.
I glaze over. But anyway.
Too young for the monarchy, too old for the emoji movie. We were homeless today.
We were politically homeless, Michael. Geriatric millennials are finding themselves as politically
We were culturally homeless because all we could watch was either the funeral of a monarch or the emoji movie, us poor millennials stuck in the middle. We're in agreement on this. Do you think it might have backfired? The sort of wall-to-wall media coverage. Obviously, I don't think those 49% of people now suddenly think let's get rid of the monarchy, but I think they might think, God, this has gone a bit overboard, hasn't it?
No, I don't think it will back. I mean, they've done everything. This is the generation. This is the manufacture of consent. It's why they do it. I don't think it's backfired. No, I think everything's gone off to a T. I think they've dotted all the T's, crossed all the I's. They've put a ribbon on it. They've sent it first class, and this is how history will remember the end of the Elizabethan age. I do think they've got if you're a monarchist, I do think there are a series of problems, which of course, as we'll talk about in a story, the next story, the one after, the integrity of the Union and King Charles III. Because of course his mother was very good as a neutral monarch, not really getting involved in politics, although she did in Australia. She helped remove Gough Whitlam. In the UK, she helped impose one Tory candidate over another after Harold Macmillan. So we'll see. I think the Tories, interchangeable. I think the monarchy does have problems with regards to the succession of Charles III, but it has nothing to do with what's happened over the last week. And the people who find this coverage a bit over the top were probably expecting as much. I challenge anyone to be surprised by the coverage. For me, what's interesting, Michael, actually, is the dissonance between the mediatization of this all and then your everyday conversations with people. Like, there's a real dissonance. Obviously, lots of respect for the woman. I'm not saying that everybody on the grassroots outside of Westminster is a Republican, far from it. But there's a lot more acceptance, acknowledgement. Well, she was 96, 97. That's life. She lived for a very long time. There's a really big gulf between that and then this sort of official narrative that's being pumped out from the BBC and others, just non-stop, non-stop platitudes and superlatives. That to me is interesting, but no, I don't think it's going to radicalize anybody. I think there will be moments of that, though. I think, for instance, the investiture of Prince William in Wales next year, I think that could radicalize people. There will be lots of moments over the next 18 months where I think you will see quite strong, profound arguments made for a republic.
Yeah, I think also with the coronation of King Charles, because presumably the BBC will have a similar approach. And I think if they do wall-to-wall coverage of that for a number of days, people are going to be a bit annoyed and they're going to feel very comfortable expressing that because it's no longer related to someone's passing. And there isn't the same affection to him as there is towards the Queen. I also wonder if this will potentially undermine the BBC more than the monarchy because, well, undermine among some people. I think in a way this will massively shore up the BBC, because I think a lot of what they've been doing over the past 10 days is saying, look, Tories, you can fund us because we are actually pillars of the establishment. We're doing our job properly. I think there will be, especially younger people, who think, what the hell is the BBC doing? It is a state broadcaster. So that could be risky for them, even though I'm sure that their chair is like, this has gone so well. So what if we pissed off 49% of the public? The Tories, the people in power, love us. And Keir Starmer, who sounds just as brown-nosy towards the royal family, he's also going to be pretty happy with this. He or Liz Truss will obviously be Prime Minister in 3 years' time. Republicanism appears to have been banned from our TV screens over the past few days. But there's one part of public life where dissent has got through. This was how some Dundee United fans marked a minute of silence before a match against Rangers.
Following the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, please now observe a minute of silence in her memory, which will start with the referee's whistle, followed by the national anthem.
The chant you heard there was Lizzie's in a box, Lizzie's in a box, to the tune of Give It Up by KC and the Sunshine Band. The following day, some Celtic fans had their say. This was a planned minute of applause before Sunday's game against St Mirren. So my suspicion there is that the organisers, suspected that Celtic fans, or some of them at least, wouldn't take part in a minute of silence. I thought a minute of applause would be a safer option. And then very innovatively, a group of Celtic fans sung the chant, clap if you hate the Royals, clap if you hate the monarchy, which put everyone else in the stadium in presumably a very awkward situation, or at least the monarchists in the stadium in an awkward situation. Aaron, I want you to explain the context here. I presume it's not a coincidence that Celtic and Dundee fans, or at least groups of them, are the ones who have been hostile to the Royals and not willing to participate in the state-mandated minutes of applause or minutes of silence.
Well, Celtic is obviously it's quite an obvious answer. This is a football club immersed in Republican tradition, ties to Ireland. That's nothing new. Dundee United, a bit more surprising. I mean, their historic name was Dundee Hibernian. So again, similar historic roots to Celtic and the kinds of demographics they reflected and represented. But in recent years, less so. Important to distinguish between Dundee and Dundee United. Lots of people on Twitter saying, it's Dundee, it's not Dundee. Although if you go on Google, you'll see that their stadia are right slap bang next to each other, which is quite amusing given they're about the same capacity. I think something like 14, 15,000. Dundee United play at Tannadice. I don't know where Dundee play. My apologies, Scottish football fans. But yeah, Celtic somewhat predictable. Dundee United less so. We're not showing it there, but there were also some interesting boos and shouts and names being called at the Everton match, which was more of a surprise to me because this is something I've been trying to sort of think and talk about over the last several days. I don't think we're going to see a groundswell of republicanism in England. I think that's a long way off. I think it's close to impossible. But I do think that in the periphery and the sort of Celtic fringe, Wales and Scotland, I think there are real challenges for the House of Windsor. And don't underestimate the fact that people in Scotland, okay, yes, of course it's Celtic, or yes, of course it's Dundee United. But when people don't self-censor en masse, that makes far less radical things quite openly permissible to go on television and say, I'm a Republican, or to say it in the pub. So I think we're looking actually at increasingly diverging political cultures between England, Scotland, and Wales. Of course, they've always been different, but I think that's getting stronger over time. And finally, if anybody says, well, look, this is Celtic, they've always been like that. Not so fast. Jock Stein, who was their manager in 1967 when they won the European Cup, the first British team to win the European Cup, the Lisbon Lions, he got an OBE in response to that, and he would have got a knighthood. But the myth is that he didn't get a knighthood because of apparently they were a bit too aggressive as a team. They got too many red cards. Otherwise, he would have got a knighthood. So yes, of course, Celtic have always been this amazing institution representing, Scottish Irish community, Catholics, etc. But this level of overt disdain and hostility, which, important to say, it's not universal across Celtic fans, but it's there and it's vocal, obviously. The extent of that and the overt nature of it, that is new.
Let's wrap up there. And I can promise you, I have actually enjoyed the royal coverage, because I do think it has been a very interesting national moment to find out about the real nature of institutions in Britain, how propaganda works, how ideology works, what the public might be looking for, meaning in their lives, or however we want to look at it. But we will be doing less royal coverage over the next few Tisky Sours, I do promise. So it has been a pleasure speaking to you over these days of national mourning, but we will presumably be moving on to more traditional terrain by Wednesday. Aaron, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Michael. You've been immaculate over the last week. You've been the Hugh Edwards of the left, Michael.
That's very kind of you to say. We will be back on Wednesday, as I say, at 7 p.m. as usual. You've been watching Tisky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.